Lost in a Christmas Eve blizzard, the cowboy left her cabin. But his 5-year-old walked back here is the expanded story. Daniel Carter lived far from busy towns, in a quiet valley surrounded by tall pine trees and rolling hills. Winter had settled deep into the land, covering everything with thick white snow. His ranch stood alone at the edge of the valley, a small wooden house with a wide porch and a barn that had seen many seasons. He woke before sunrise every day, not because he wanted to, but because responsibility left him no choice. His 5-year-old son, Caleb, depended on him for everything. Since losing his wife years ago, Daniel had learned how to be both father and mother. He cooked simple meals, washed clothes, and told bedtime stories even when he felt too tired to speak. Caleb was a cheerful child with bright eyes that carried both curiosity and quiet understanding beyond his age. He often followed his father around the ranch, asking questions about horses, snow, and the stars. Daniel rarely smiled, but when he looked at his son, a soft warmth showed in his face. The week before Christmas brought heavy clouds and cold winds. Local radio stations warned about a strong winter storm approaching the mountains. Neighbors prepared early, stacking firewood and staying indoors. Daniel listened carefully but did not feel afraid. Storms were part of life here. Still, he made a list of supplies they needed. Flour, canned food, lamp oil, and medicine for Caleb's occasional cough. Early that morning, he saddled his horse and prepared to ride into town before the storm arrived. Caleb stood by the door, wrapped in a thick coat. "Will you come back before dark?" he asked. Daniel nodded gently. "Always." The road to town was long but familiar. Snow crunched under the horse's hooves as Daniel rode through the valley. He greeted a few ranchers along the way, exchanging quiet waves. Everyone moved quickly, knowing the weather would turn soon. The small town looked busy compared to its usual calm. People rushed between shops carrying supplies. Daniel bought what he needed without wasting time. While waiting near the general store, he overheard 2 older men talking about a cabin deeper in the hills. "They say someone's staying there again," one man said. "That old place, in this weather?" The other replied with disbelief. Daniel listened quietly. The cabin they mentioned had been empty for years after its previous owner passed away. The thought of someone living there during a blizzard worried him. The hills could become dangerous even for experienced locals. He told himself it was not his problem. He had a child waiting at home. But as he packed his supplies, unease stayed in his mind. On his way back, snow began falling lightly, small flakes drifting through the air like feathers. The sky turned gray, and the wind started to grow stronger. Daniel guided his horse carefully, thinking about Caleb waiting near the warm stove. When he reached a fork in the trail, he stopped. One path led home, the other led toward the old cabin. He hesitated for a long moment. Finally, he turned toward the cabin. The ride became slower as snow deepened. Pine trees swayed under growing wind. After nearly an hour, he saw smoke rising faintly from a chimney. Relief mixed with concern. He approached the cabin and knocked on the door. After a pause, it opened slightly, revealing a woman with tired eyes and a cautious expression. "Yes," she asked softly. "My name is Daniel," he said. "I live nearby. I heard someone moved here, storm's coming, thought you might need help." The woman hesitated before opening the door wider. Inside, the cabin looked half-prepared. Boxes lay against walls, and a small fire struggled in the fireplace. "I'm Alina," she said. "I just arrived a few days ago. I didn't realize the weather could get this bad." Daniel stepped inside, shaking snow from his coat. He quickly noticed small problems: windows not sealed properly, firewood stacked too far from the door, and water buckets not filled. Without wasting words, he began helping. He showed her how to secure the shutters against strong wind. He carried extra wood inside and adjusted the fire so it burned stronger. Alina watched quietly, surprised by his calm efficiency. "You didn't have to come," she said after a while. Daniel shrugged. No one should be alone during a storm without preparation. As they worked, they spoke in short conversations. Alina explained she inherited the cabin from a relative and wanted a fresh start away from city noise. Daniel shared little about himself, only mentioning his ranch and his son. When Alina heard about Caleb, her expression softened. "He must be proud of you." Daniel did not answer immediately. He was not used to talking about feelings. Instead, he checked the lanterns and filled them with oil. Outside, snow began falling faster. Wind pressed against the cabin walls with growing force. "You should stay until the storm slows," Alina suggested. Daniel looked toward the window, thinking about time passing. I need to get back before dark, he said quietly. He finished securing the door and ensured she had enough supplies for the night. Alina thanked him again, her voice filled with gratitude. Before leaving, he paused. Keep the fire strong. Don't open the door unless necessary. She nodded. Daniel stepped back into the storm. Snowflakes hit his face sharply as wind grew stronger. He mounted his horse and turned toward home. At first, the trail remained visible, but soon, heavy snow erased familiar marks. The world turned white and silent except for the sound of wind. Daniel leaned forward, guiding the horse carefully. He felt confident at first. He had traveled these hills for years, but the storm intensified faster than expected. Visibility dropped. Trees looked like shadows. The cold bit through his gloves. Still, he moved forward, focused on one thought: Caleb waiting at home. The sky darkened earlier than usual as thick clouds covered the sun. Snow piled deeper, slowing progress. Daniel realized the journey would take longer than planned. Behind him, the cabin disappeared into the storm, its small light hidden by swirling snow. Ahead, the path home felt uncertain. But Daniel kept riding, determined to return, unaware that this decision would change everything before the night ended. The wind grew louder as Daniel rode deeper into the storm. Snow did not fall gently anymore. It rushed sideways, carried by sharp gusts that made it hard to breathe. His horse moved slowly now, lifting its legs with effort through the thick white ground. The trail that had once been clear was gone. Everything looked the same: trees, hills, rocks, all covered in heavy snow. Daniel pulled his scarf higher over his face. He tried to remember the landmarks he had passed many times before. There had been a broken fence post near the curve of the trail. A tall pine tree shaped like a fork, a narrow dip in the land where water flowed in spring. But now, under the storm, nothing looked familiar. He leaned close to his horse and spoke softly to keep it calm. The animal was strong and loyal, but even it seemed unsure. The wind pushed against them, making balance difficult. Daniel knew he had to stay steady. Panic would only make things worse. Back at the ranch, Caleb sat near the small window, watching snow gather against the glass. The fire crackled gently in the stove, filling the room with warmth. The clock on the wall ticked slowly. It was already later than his father usually returned from town. Caleb had placed a small wooden toy horse on the table, pretending it was riding through snow. He imagined his father coming through the door with a tired smile, shaking snow from his coat. But as the sky outside turned darker, a quiet worry began to grow in the child's heart. He walked to the door and opened it slightly. Cold air rushed inside, making him step back quickly. The storm was stronger than he had ever seen. Snowflakes hit his face like tiny pieces of ice. He closed the door and looked at the clock again. Meanwhile, Daniel felt the cold slowly creeping into his hands and feet. He flexed his fingers, trying to keep blood moving. He could not afford to lose strength. He knew storms in these mountains could last many hours, sometimes longer. Suddenly, his horse stumbled. Daniel tightened his grip and steadied it, but he realized something serious. They had drifted off the main path. The ground beneath the snow felt uneven, unfamiliar. He turned the horse slightly, hoping to correct direction. But the wind roared louder, covering any sound that might guide him. The world felt empty and endless. Daniel stopped for a moment behind a cluster of thick trees to block some of the wind. He tried to think clearly. If he continued blindly, he might move farther from home. But standing still too long in such cold was also dangerous. He closed his eyes briefly and pictured Caleb's face. That image gave him strength. He decided to move slowly along what felt like a downward slope, believing it might lead toward the valley. At the cabin, Alina added more wood to the fire. The shutters rattled loudly as wind struck the walls. She tried reading a small book to calm her thoughts, but her mind kept returning to Daniel riding into the storm. She had seen many winters in the city, but nothing like this. The mountains felt wild and powerful. She walked to the window and wiped away frost with her sleeve, trying to see beyond the white blur. She whispered to herself, hoping he would reach home safely. Back at the ranch, Caleb could not sit still anymore. He remembered his father once telling him, "If I'm ever late, stay inside and wait." But he also remembered another lesson: we help people when they need it. The child walked to his small bedroom and looked at a drawing hanging on the wall. It showed him and his father standing beside their horse under a bright blue sky. He touched the paper gently. He tried to be brave. He placed another piece of wood into the stove, just like his father had shown him. The fire burned stronger. Outside, the storm seemed endless. Daniel continued forward, but his horse's steps became slower. Snow reached nearly to its knees now. The cold air burned Daniel's lungs. He realized he could not continue riding much longer without risking the animal's safety. He spotted a large rock formation ahead, partly blocking the wind. It was not a perfect shelter, but it offered some protection. Daniel carefully dismounted and led his horse behind the rock. He removed a small blanket from his saddlebag and covered the horse's back to keep it warm. Then he stood there, breathing heavily, trying to gather his thoughts. He checked the sky, but all he saw were thick gray clouds spinning overhead. He knew he needed to keep moving soon. But he also knew exhaustion could cloud judgment. Back at the ranch, Caleb made a decision that came from pure love rather than logic. He believed his father might be near the old cabin. He remembered riding there once in summer when the hills were green. He walked to the coat rack and pulled down his warmest jacket. It was slightly too big for him, but it would protect him from cold. He wrapped a scarf around his neck clumsily and pulled on his small boots. Before opening the door, he looked around the house. Everything felt quiet and still. "I'll bring him back," he whispered to himself. He opened the door carefully. Snow had piled high against it, making it hard to push. Cold wind rushed around him, but he stepped outside anyway. The world looked enormous and frightening under the storm. Snow swirled around his small figure, but he remembered the direction of the hills and began walking slowly, each step sinking deep. Back near the rock formation, Daniel felt slightly stronger after resting a few minutes. He decided to continue on foot, leading his horse carefully. He hoped moving would keep both of them warm, but the snow kept falling without mercy. He had no idea that while he struggled against the storm, his 5-year-old son had stepped into that same dangerous night, following love into the white darkness. The storm did not slow. Snow covered the valley like a thick blanket, hiding paths, fences, and even familiar shapes that people relied on to find their way. The wind moved in long waves, sometimes quiet for a moment, and then suddenly strong again, pushing against everything in its path. Caleb walked slowly through the snow, each step sinking deep. His small boots filled with cold powder, but he kept moving. He held his scarf close to his face the way his father had taught him. The world around him looked different than he remembered. Trees seemed taller and darker, and shadows moved strangely under the falling snow. He tried to follow the direction he believed led toward the old cabin. He remembered riding there once when the weather was warm. Back then, birds had sung in the trees and sunlight had guided the way. Now there was only white silence and the sound of wind. At first, he felt brave. He imagined reaching the cabin and telling the woman there that his father needed help. That thought gave him strength. But after a while, fear began to creep into his heart. The storm made it hard to see far ahead, and he felt very small under the wide sky. He stopped for a moment and looked back. The ranch was no longer visible. Only snow remained behind him. Meanwhile, Daniel continued moving slowly through the storm. Leading his horse by hand had become necessary because the animal struggled to walk through the deep snow. Daniel's legs felt heavy, and every breath filled his lungs with icy air. He tried to stay calm. He knew panic would only waste energy. He focused on small goals, one step, then another. He believed he was heading toward the valley, but doubt began to grow in his mind. The wind shifted direction suddenly, blowing snow directly into his face. He turned slightly, trying to shield his eyes. The world blurred around him, making it difficult to judge distance. He thought of Caleb waiting at home. That thought became his anchor. He promised himself he would not stop moving. Back at the cabin, Alina added more wood to the fire and wrapped herself in a thick blanket. The storm outside sounded like waves crashing against the walls. She paced slowly across the room, feeling restless. She kept thinking about Daniel leaving earlier. She had watched him disappear into the snow, and now the storm seemed much worse than anyone had expected. A feeling of unease settled in her chest. She walked to the window again, trying to see anything beyond the white haze, but there was nothing. Then she heard something faint, a soft knocking sound. At first she thought it was just the wind hitting the door. But the sound came again, weaker this time. Her heart jumped. She moved quickly toward the door and opened it carefully. Standing outside was Caleb. He looked small and covered in snow, his cheeks red from cold. His eyes were wide but determined. Alina gasped in shock and quickly pulled him inside. She closed the door behind him and wrapped a blanket around his shoulders. "Where did you come from?" she asked gently, kneeling beside him. "My dad, he didn't come home," Caleb said quietly. "I think he came here." Alina felt a mix of surprise and concern. She helped him sit near the fire and gave him warm tea to hold. As he warmed up, he explained that he had left the ranch because he wanted to help bring his father back. Alina listened carefully, realizing how serious the situation had become. If Caleb had walked all the way here alone, then Daniel might still be somewhere in the storm. She felt a heavy responsibility settle on her shoulders. Outside, Daniel's strength began to fade. He stumbled once and caught himself against the horse's side. He knew he needed shelter soon. The cold was becoming harder to ignore. He scanned the landscape, searching for anything that might help: a cluster of trees, a ridge, a structure. Through the swirling snow, he thought he saw a faint outline ahead. He moved toward it slowly. Back at the cabin, Alina wrapped Caleb in another blanket and checked his hands and feet to make sure they were warm enough. She praised him gently for his bravery, but also explained how dangerous the storm was. Caleb nodded, but his thoughts stayed focused on his father. "We have to find him," he said. Alina hesitated. Going outside during the storm carried risk, but doing nothing felt impossible. She knew Daniel had helped her earlier without hesitation. Now it was her turn to help. She waited for a brief moment when the wind slowed slightly. Then she gathered supplies: a lantern, a rope, extra blankets, and a thick coat for herself. She explained to Caleb that they would stay close together and move slowly. Holding the lantern carefully, she opened the door. The cold air rushed inside again, but this time they stepped out together. Caleb pointed in the direction he believed his father had taken. Alina trusted his memory and began walking carefully through the snow. Each step felt heavy, and the lantern light flickered against the wind. They called out Daniel's name, their voices carried away by the storm. Farther away, Daniel noticed a faint light moving through the snow. At first, he thought he was imagining it. But then he heard a distant voice. He tried to respond, but his voice sounded weak. He gathered his remaining strength and moved toward the light. Alina continued forward, her eyes searching carefully. Suddenly, she saw a dark shape near a snow-covered ridge. "Daniel," she called. The figure moved slightly. Caleb ran forward a few steps before Alina gently pulled him back, guiding him safely. Together they reached Daniel, who leaned heavily against his horse, exhausted but alive. Relief filled the air as father and son saw each other. Daniel's eyes widened with surprise and emotion. "You came," he whispered, both amazed and worried. Caleb hugged him tightly. Alina helped support Daniel as they slowly turned back toward the cabin, the lantern lighting their path through the endless snow. Alina supported Daniel carefully as they walked back toward the cabin. Caleb stayed close, holding his father's hand tightly as if afraid he might disappear again. The lantern light moved gently across the snow, creating small golden circles in the white darkness. The storm had not stopped completely, but the wind had slowed enough to make the journey possible. Daniel felt weak, his steps slow and heavy. Every movement required effort, but seeing his son gave him strength. He looked down at Caleb, both grateful and worried. The thought that a 5-year-old had walked through the storm alone filled him with emotion he struggled to express. "You should not have come out," Daniel said softly, his voice rough from cold. Caleb looked up with serious eyes. "I wanted to help you come back." Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he squeezed the child's hand gently. Sometimes love spoke louder than words. The cabin appeared through the falling snow like a safe light waiting for them. Alina opened the door quickly and helped Daniel inside. Warm air wrapped around them, and the crackling fire felt almost unreal after the harsh cold outside. She guided Daniel toward a chair near the fire and placed thick blankets over his shoulders. Caleb stayed beside him, watching carefully. Alina moved with quiet focus, heating water and bringing warm drinks. Daniel held the cup with trembling hands, feeling warmth slowly returning to his fingers. He watched Alina as she worked. There was strength in her calm movements, the kind of strength that came from facing difficulties before. "You saved me," he said quietly. Alina shook her head gently. "We helped each other." Caleb sat close to the fire, slowly relaxing now that his father was safe. His eyes grew heavy, but he refused to sleep. He wanted to stay awake and make sure Daniel would not leave again. Outside, the storm continued to whisper against the walls, but inside the cabin, everything felt still and peaceful. As time passed, Daniel began to recover from exhaustion. Alina checked his hands and face carefully, making sure he was warming properly. She added more wood to the fire and prepared simple food from the supplies she had. They ate quietly at first. The silence felt comfortable rather than awkward. The shared experience of the storm created an unspoken connection between them. Later, as Caleb finally fell asleep wrapped in blankets near the fire, Daniel and Alina spoke more openly. Daniel told her about his life in the valley. He explained how he had moved there years ago with his wife, hoping for a peaceful life away from noise. After she passed away, the ranch became both his refuge and his responsibility. Raising Caleb alone had been difficult, but it gave his life meaning. Alina listened carefully, understanding the weight behind his words. She shared pieces of her own story, too. She had lived in a busy city for many years, working long hours and feeling disconnected from everything real. After losing someone important to her, she decided she needed a new beginning. The cabin had been left to her unexpectedly, and she chose to take the chance. "I thought I wanted to be alone," she admitted quietly. "But tonight showed me something different." Daniel nodded slowly. He understood that feeling more than he wanted to admit. The storm outside grew quieter as the night moved forward. Snow continued falling, but the wind lost its anger. The cabin felt like a small island of warmth in a frozen world. Caleb stirred in his sleep and reached for his father. Daniel moved closer and gently rested a hand on his son's shoulder. Watching him sleep filled Daniel with deep gratitude. He realized how close he had come to never seeing that peaceful face again. Alina noticed the expression on Daniel's face and understood without needing words. She sat across from him, holding her warm drink, allowing silence to speak for them. Hours passed slowly. The fire burned steady, and the soft light created long shadows across the wooden walls. Christmas Eve had arrived quietly while they fought the storm. At one point, Caleb woke briefly and smiled when he saw both adults sitting nearby. "We're safe," he murmured before falling asleep again. Daniel leaned back, finally allowing himself to rest. The tension he carried for years seemed to loosen slightly. Being forced to accept help had changed something inside him. Alina offered him a place to lie down, and he agreed reluctantly. He had always been used to solving problems alone, but tonight showed him that strength could also mean trusting others. While Daniel rested, Alina watched the fire carefully. She thought about how quickly life could change. Only hours earlier, she had been alone in an unfamiliar cabin, uncertain about her decision to move there. Now she felt connected to two people who had entered her life through a storm. The night grew deeper, peaceful despite the weather outside. Snow covered the world quietly, reshaping the land for morning. Daniel woke later feeling stronger. The warmth of the cabin and rest had helped him recover. He walked slowly toward the window and looked outside. The storm had softened into gentle snowfall. Alina joined him, standing beside him silently. "Thank you," he said again. She smiled softly. "You would have done the same." He thought about that and realized she was right. They spoke about practical things next: how to reach the ranch once the weather cleared, how to ensure the path was safe for Caleb, and how neighbors might respond once communication returned. But beneath the practical talk was a growing sense of trust. The hours before dawn felt calm and almost magical. Christmas Eve became a time not of loneliness, but of unexpected connection. Daniel sat beside Caleb again as morning approached. He understood that life had shifted slightly. He had always believed survival meant standing alone against hardship. Tonight showed him another truth: sometimes survival meant allowing others to stand beside you. As the fire continued to burn and the storm faded into quiet snowfall, the three of them waited together for morning. No longer strangers brought together by chance, but people connected by courage, kindness, and a shared night that would change all their futures. Morning arrived, slowly bringing a soft, pale light through the frost-covered windows. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a peaceful silence. Snow lay deep across the valley, sparkling gently under the rising sun. The world looked calm and untouched, as if the night's struggle had been erased by quiet beauty. Inside the cabin, the fire still burned low but steady. Alina woke first. She stretched slowly and walked toward the window, brushing away a thin layer of frost to look outside. The sky was clear, and for the first time since the storm began, she felt a sense of relief. She turned and saw Daniel sitting near Caleb, who was still asleep. Daniel looked tired but stronger than before. He nodded at Alina with a small, grateful smile. "It's calm now," she said softly. Daniel stood and walked to the window beside her. He took a deep breath, watching the sunlight reflect across the snow. The danger had passed, but he knew the deep snow would make travel difficult for a while. Caleb stirred and opened his eyes. For a moment he looked confused, then remembered everything. His face brightened when he saw his father safe beside him. "Is it morning?" he asked. Daniel smiled gently. "Yes, and we made it through." Caleb sat up quickly and looked around the cabin. The warmth, the quiet, and the presence of both adults made him feel secure. He stretched and laughed softly, the sound filling the room with life. Alina prepared a simple breakfast using what she had: warm bread, tea, and a small pot of soup heated slowly over the fire. They sat together at the wooden table, sharing food and stories. The atmosphere felt different now, more relaxed, like old friends rather than strangers. Daniel found himself speaking more openly than usual. He told small stories about Caleb's childhood, the first time he tried to ride a horse, the way he laughed when chasing chickens around the yard. Alina listened with genuine interest, occasionally sharing small memories from her own past. After breakfast, they stepped outside carefully. The cold air felt fresh and clean. Snow reached nearly to their knees, making movement slow but manageable. Daniel looked toward the distant hills, thinking about the ranch. He felt a strong pull to return home, but he also felt gratitude for the cabin that had protected them through the storm. "We should head back once the path becomes clearer," he said. Alina nodded. "I'll help however I can." They spent the morning clearing a small path around the cabin and checking for any damage. The storm had been strong, but the structure held firm. Caleb helped by carrying small pieces of wood and laughing whenever he slipped into the snow. The child's energy brought lightness to the day. Daniel watched him carefully, feeling both pride and concern. He knelt beside Caleb at one point. "You were very brave," he said quietly. "But next time you must wait. The storm was dangerous." Caleb nodded seriously. "I know. I just didn't want you to be alone." Daniel hugged him gently, understanding the love behind the decision. Later, distant sounds broke the quiet, the faint rumble of an engine. They turned toward the sound and saw a snow vehicle approaching slowly through the valley. A local rescue team had begun checking remote areas after the storm cleared. Relief washed over them as the vehicle reached the cabin. The rescue workers greeted them warmly, surprised but happy to see everyone safe. They had received reports of the severe storm and were checking for anyone who might need assistance. Daniel explained briefly what had happened. The rescuers looked at Caleb with amazement when they heard about his walk through the storm. "That's a strong little cowboy," one of them said kindly. Caleb smiled shyly and held his father's hand. The rescuers offered to guide them back to the ranch safely. Daniel thanked them, but before leaving, he turned to Alina. "You saved us," he said again. Alina shook her head gently. "We saved each other." They gathered their things and prepared for the journey back. The path through the snow felt long but safe with guidance. As they walked, Daniel noticed how natural it felt to have Alina beside them. Caleb spoke to her happily, asking questions and telling stories about the ranch. When they finally reached the ranch house, Daniel paused at the door. He looked around at the familiar place that had always been his world. It felt different now, less lonely. Inside, everything was as they had left it. The fire had burned out, but the house still held warmth from memories. Caleb ran to his favorite chair and laughed, happy to be home again. Alina stood quietly near the doorway, unsure if she should stay longer. Daniel noticed and spoke gently. "You're welcome here anytime," he said. "This place, it's safer with friends." She smiled, touched by his words. Over the next days, neighbors came to check on them. The story of the storm spread quickly, especially the part about the small child who walked through the snow to help his father. People brought food, helped clear paths, and shared laughter. The experience changed Daniel in ways he did not expect. He began opening himself to the community more, accepting help without feeling weak. He also visited the cabin often, helping Alina repair small damages and prepare for the rest of winter. Their bond grew slowly and naturally, based on trust rather than sudden change. Caleb became the bridge between them, his joy bringing them together again and again. Christmas celebrations arrived quietly but meaningfully. Instead of spending the holiday alone, they gathered at the cabin, sharing warm food, simple decorations, and stories by the fire. Daniel looked around at the glowing room and realized that life had given him something unexpected, not just survival after a storm, but connection and hope. The blizzard had taken away certainty, but it had also brought people together. And as snow continued to fall gently outside, he understood that sometimes the hardest nights lead to the brightest mornings, especially when hearts choose to walk toward each other instead of away.